At 11:30 on the morning of December 22nd, 1944, Private First Class Leo Palmer crouched in his frozen foxhole south of Bastonia, Belgium, watching 4 German soldiers approach through the snow carrying white flags. The temperature was 20 degrees C. His hands were so numb he could barely grip his Browning automatic rifle. Ice crystals formed in his nostrils with each breath. He had been in this position for 48 hours without hot food, without adequate winter clothing, without hope of reinforcement. The German officers walking toward him wore long wool overcoats and shiny black boots. They looked warm, well-fed, confident. Palmer knew what they wanted. They wanted the Americans to surrender. The senior German officer was Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps. The junior officer, Lieutenant Helmuth Henny of the Panzer Lehr Operations Section, carried a briefcase under his arm. Inside that briefcase was an ultimatum that promised total annihilation if the Americans refused to surrender within 2 hours. The Germans had every reason to expect success. They had the 101st Airborne Division completely surrounded. 5 German divisions against 1 American division. The Americans were outnumbered 5-1. They had no tanks worth mentioning. They were running out of ammunition, medical supplies, food. The weather had grounded all Allied aircraft for 6 days. No air support, no supply drops, no hope of immediate relief. What the Germans did not know was that the American commander in Bastonia was a 46-year-old artillery officer named Anthony McAuliffe, who had never heard of the word surrender. And in the next 17 minutes, McAuliffe would give a one-word reply that would echo through military history, inspire a surrounded division to fight on, confuse and demoralize the German command, and help turn the tide of Hitler's last desperate offensive in Western Europe, the Battle of Deux. The Bulge had started 6 days earlier on December 16th, when 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks smashed through the American lines in the Ardennes Forest. It was Hitler's final gamble, a massive surprise offensive designed to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. Hitler had scraped together his last reserves, pulled veteran divisions from the Eastern Front, collected every operational tank and assault gun he could find. Boys of 16 and men of 50 were pressed into service. This was Germany's last chance to avoid total defeat. The German build-up had been masterful. Units moved only at night under radio silence. Horses pulled artillery to avoid engine noise. The Wehrmacht concentrated 3 armies in the Ardennes, opposite the weakest part of the American line. They achieved what military professionals call operational surprise. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. American intelligence had failed to detect the German buildup. Ultra-intercepts had dried up because the Germans were maintaining radio silence. Aerial reconnaissance was hampered by bad weather. Ground patrols reported increased activity, but were dismissed as nervous imagination. The frontline units in the Ardennes were either inexperienced divisions getting their first taste of combat or exhausted divisions sent there to rest. The 106th Infantry Division had been in the line for 5 days. The 28th Infantry Division was recuperating from the Hürtgen Forest bloodbath. They were not prepared for what hit them. The German plan required speed. They had to capture key road junctions before the Allies could react, before the weather cleared, and Allied aircraft returned to dominate the battlefield. Bastogne was one of those key road junctions. 7 major roads converged on this small Belgian market town control Bastogne control movement through the southern Ardennes. Without Bastonia, the German offensive would bog down. With Bastonia, they could drive to Antwerp. General Dwight Eisenhower recognized the danger immediately. On December 17th, he ordered the 101st Airborne Division to move from their rest area at Morillon-le-Rand near Reims, France, to Bastonia. The division had been recovering from 3 months of combat in Holland during Operation Market Garden. They had taken heavy casualties. Many of the men were on leave in Paris. The division commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington attending a staff conference. The assistant division commander, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, was in England. That left Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander, in temporary command. McAuliffe was not supposed to be commanding an airborne division in the biggest battle of the Western Front. He was an artilleryman, a 1918 West Point graduate who had spent most of his career around howitzers and fire direction centers. Born in Washington, D.C. on July 2, 1898, McAuliffe had attended West Virginia University before entering West Point in 1917. His class underwent an accelerated program due to World War I, graduating in November 1918, just as that war ended. For 25 years, McAuliffe had served in various artillery positions, a competent but unremarkable officer slowly climbing the ranks. World War II changed everything. He had jumped into Normandy with the 101st on D-Day, breaking his back during a practice jump in May, but still going into combat on June 6th, when Brigadier General Don Pratt was killed during the glider landings. McAuliffe was promoted to Assistant Division Commander. He had proven himself under fire in Normandy and again in Holland during Operation Market Garden, and now through circumstances beyond anyone's control. The defense of Bastonia, and perhaps the outcome of the entire German offensive, rested on his shoulders. The 101st started arriving in Bastogne late on December 18th, after a brutal 107-mile truck ride through freezing rain and snow. The journey itself was a nightmare. Men packed into open trucks, no room to sit, standing for hours in the freezing darkness. Some trucks broke down and had to be abandoned. Others skidded off icy roads. Men jumped from moving vehicles to relieve themselves, then ran to catch up. They passed retreating American units heading the opposite direction, defeated troops warning them to turn back, that the Germans had Tigers, Panthers, entire divisions. The paratroopers ignored them and pressed on. They came without proper winter clothing. The division had been resting, refitting, expecting to spend Christmas in camp. Many men lacked overcoats, winter boots, or gloves. They wore summer uniforms with field jackets, jump boots that would freeze solid, thin gloves that offered no protection against frostbite. Some wrapped their feet in burlap sacks. Others stuffed newspapers inside their jackets for insulation. They had been told this would be a short deployment, a few days at most. They would stop the Germans, hand over to relieving units, and return to camp. No one expected to be surrounded. No one expected to be under siege. No one expected what was about to happen. By December 20th, German forces had cut all roads leading into Bastogne. The 101st, along with elements of Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and various other units that had retreated into the town, were completely encircled. About 14,000 American troops, trapped in a town that before the war had 8,000 inhabitants. Outside the perimeter, 5 German divisions pressed in. The 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and elements of 2 other divisions. The Germans had tanks, artillery, ammunition, supplies, and time. The Americans had determination. The first major loss that shook the defenders came on December 19th, when Lieutenant Colonel James Lorade was killed by German artillery at Noville. Lorade commanded the 1st Battalion, 56th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He had installed his headquarters in a building in Noville, a small village north of Bastogne. A German 88mm shell crashed through the building. Lorade was killed instantly by the explosion. Major William de Sabre, who was with him, was severely wounded, losing an eye. The sudden death of a battalion commander sent shock through the regiment. If a lieutenant colonel could die that quickly, that easily, what chance did privates and corporals have? The second devastating blow came when most of the division medical company was captured. The medics had set up an aid station in what they thought was a secure area. They were treating wounded from the previous day's fighting when German forces suddenly appeared. The Germans had infiltrated through a gap in the American perimeter during the night. Within minutes, the aid station was overrun. Over 100 medical personnel captured, including crucial surgical staff. Dozens of wounded Americans taken prisoner, medical supplies, ambulances, surgical equipment, all lost. From that point on, the wounded in Bastogne would receive only the most basic medical care. The losses mounted daily. Each death, each capture, each wounded soldier who could not be properly treated added to the desperation. Company commanders who started with 150 men were down to 60 or 70. Platoons that should have 40 men had 15 or 20 squad. Leaders commanded 3 or 4 soldiers instead of 12. The Yanbai defenders knew they were on their own. No relief was coming soon. The weather prevented any air support or supply drops. German artillery pounded the town day and night. The screaming Mimis Nibelua rockets came in salvos of 6. Their distinctive howl terrifying soldiers and civilians alike. 88mm shells punched through buildings like they were made of paper. 250mm howitzers turned entire blocks into rubble. The medieval buildings offered little protection. Stone walls that had stood for centuries were blown apart by high explosive shells. The Cathedral of St. Peter took multiple direct hits, but somehow remained standing. The town square became a moonscape of craters and debris. Civilians huddled in cellars as their homes collapsed above them. Some cellars held 50 or 60 people. Men, women, children, babies, all pressed together in the darkness, listening to the thunder above, wondering if the next shell would bury them alive. The cold was as much an enemy as the Germans. Temperatures dropped to -28°C on the worst nights. Rifle bolts froze solid. Machine gun mechanisms had to be worked constantly to prevent freezing. Morphine cigarettes had to be thawed in medics' mouths before injection. Blood plasma froze before it could be administered. Men urinated on their rifles to thaw the actions. They learned to keep one round chambered at all times, because working the bolt might be impossible. Frostbite claimed more casualties than German bullets. Some days men would remove their boots to check their feet and find toes black with gangrene. The medical aid stations filled with soldiers who would lose fingers, toes, entire limbs to the cold. By the morning of December 22nd, the situation in Bastogne was critical. The defenders had been under constant attack for 2 days. The temperature had dropped to -20°C at night. Wounded men were dying from exposure, as much as from their injuries. Frostbite cases overwhelmed the few remaining medics. Men's feet swelled so badly from the cold that they had to cut their boots open to prevent gangrene. The American artillery was running dangerously low on ammunition. Some batteries were down to 10 rounds per gun. Infantry units reported they had enough small arms ammunition for one more serious fight, maybe 2 if they were careful. Food supplies were critically low. Most units were on 1/3 rations. Hot food was a memory. Men survived on cold rations and melted snow. Medical supplies were almost gone. Morphine was rationed. Surgeons operated without anesthetic. Bandages were washed and reused. The wounded lay on church pews and classroom floors because there were no more stretchers. McAuliffe knew all of this. He visited the frontline units every day, driving through artillery barges in his jeep, walking the perimeter, checking positions, talking to the men. He saw the exhaustion in their faces, the hunger, the cold, the fear. He saw 18-year-old privates with feet so swollen from frostbite they could barely walk. He saw sergeants who had not slept in 4 days still directing their men, still fighting. He saw lieutenants 22, 23 years old commanding companies because all the captains were dead or wounded. He saw all of this, and he knew they could not hold much longer without relief. That was the situation when the 4 Germans approached Palmer's position at 11:30 on December 22nd. Palmer did not know what to do. Enemy soldiers approaching under a white flag that was not in the training manual. Staff Sergeant Carl Dickinson, who had been manning a position nearby, took charge. He called the Germans over. Lieutenant Hankey, who spoke perfect English, explained they had a written message for the American commander. They would consent to being blindfolded. In fact, they had brought their own blindfolds, white cloth strips that looked like they had been torn from bedsheets. Private First Class Ernest Premitz, a medic who spoke German, joined Dickinson. Together, they blindfolded the 2 German officers and led them on a circuitous route through the American positions to the F Company command post. The Germans could not see where they were going, but they could hear. They heard American voices, tired but determined. They heard weapons being cleaned and loaded. They heard sergeants giving orders. They did not hear panic. They did not hear defeat. The message was passed up the chain of command. First Sergeant Constantine. Papus informed Captain James Adams that the Germans had already presented a written message. Lieutenant William Hertzky was on the phone reading it to the battalion command post in Marvy. From battalion, it went to the 327th Regimental Headquarters. Colonel Joseph Harper, the regimental commander, was out inspecting positions. Major Alvin Jones, the regimental operations officer, took the message and drove to division headquarters. It reached McAuliffe at 11:45. He was in the headquarters basement in the Plumsey barracks, a cold, damp stone room that smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. Maps covered the walls marked with red and blue symbols, showing enemy and friendly positions. Radio operators hunched over their sets, trying to maintain communication with the scattered units. Staff officers worked at wooden tables, lit by kerosene lanterns because the electricity had been cut 2 days earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, the acting chief of staff, entered McAuliffe's sleeping quarters and woke him. "The Germans have sent some people forward to take our surrender," Moore said. McAuliffe, still groggy from sleep, sat up and said, "Surrender." "Oh, nuts." Moore handed him the German message. It was typed on 2 sheets, one in English, one in German. The diacritical marks on the German copy had been entered by hand, suggesting it was typed on an English typewriter. The English version read, "To the USA commander of the encircled town of Baston, the fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastonia have been encircled by strong German armored units. More German armored units have crossed the river near Orthoville, have taken Marsh and reached St. Huber by passing through Homprey-Cibre-Tillet. Liebremont is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted, beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastonia. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2 hours term. All the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. The German commander. McAuliffe read the message, crumpled it into a ball, threw it in a wastepaper basket and muttered again, "Oh, nuts." Then he walked out to visit some units on the western perimeter to congratulate them for eliminating a German roadblock earlier that morning. As far as he was concerned, the German demand did not deserve a response. The Germans were taking one hell of a beating, and they wanted the Americans to surrender. It was absurd, but the Germans were waiting for an answer. They had come under a flag of truce with a formal written demand. Military protocol required some kind of response. When McAuliffe returned to the headquarters an hour later, his staff was discussing what to say. Someone suggested a formal military response outlining why surrender was not an option. Someone else suggested explaining the tactical situation, that the 4th Armored Division was approaching from the south. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, had a different idea. Inside, in the presence of his staff, McAuliffe wondered aloud, "Well, I don't know what to tell them." At that point, Kinnard said, "What you said initially would be hard to beat." McCall asked, "What do you mean?" Kinnard said, "Sir, you said nuts." All members of the staff enthusiastically agreed. McAuliffe grabbed a piece of paper and wrote to the German commander. Nuts, the American commander. He handed it to a clerk and said, "Have it typed up." The typed response was given to Colonel Joseph Harper, commander of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Harper would deliver it personally to the German officers, who were still waiting blindfolded in the woods, adjacent to the F Company Foxhole command post. Harper took Private First Class Primitz with him as an interpreter. When they reached the German officers, Harper handed the message to the blindfolded Major Wagner, putting it in his hand. Hankey asked if the reply was written or verbal. Harper said it was written. Hankey asked about the contents of the message, because if it was affirmative, they were authorized to negotiate further. Harper said, "The reply consists of a single word, nuts." Hankey, not understanding, asked, "Is that reply negative or affirmative?" Harper replied, "The reply is decidedly not affirmative," adding, "If you continue this foolish attack, your losses will be tremendous." Hanke translated for Wagner. The Major nodded. The 2 blindfolded German officers were then driven again by a roundabout route back to their entry point at the Kessler farm. There the blindfolds were removed. The Germans opened and looked at the reply. They asked, "What does this mean?" They obviously did not understand the American slang. Harper and Premitz discussed how to explain it. Harper suggested, "Tell them to take a flying shit." Premitz thought about it, then straightened up, faced the Germans, and said in German, "Dukst zum Togen, you can go to hell."